Welcome along to Leaders in Focus here at IMG Studios, another stripped-back conversation with a leading sports industry executive.
Yes, today we'll be talking to Alan Gilpin, the Chief Executive of World Rugby, who's hot-footed it back from France, where the Rugby World Cup has been playing out over the last few weeks.
We'll be getting his full tournament debrief.
Fantastic tournament, brilliant audiences in France, brilliant audiences around the world, and ultimately that's what we're in it for.
We'll be hearing about private finance and its role in the growth of the women's game.
The investments needed to move quickly and the commercial return are slightly disconnected.
And we'll be hearing how he channels his emotions as a leader.
I had a tear or two in the eye at the end of a World Cup, I'm not ashamed to say.
This is Leaders in Focus.
Alan Gilpin, great to have you with us. Thank you for doing this. We are talking just a couple of weeks after the Rugby World Cup. How was it for you? Have you recovered?
I'm recovering, I think, and great to be here. Brilliant tournament, longer than we've had previously. That's one of the things we're looking at for the future. Great rugby, which is the starting point for us. Felt like a bit of an epic tournament in many respects. So lots of good rugby, but fantastic tournament, brilliant audiences in France, brilliant audiences around the world, and ultimately that's what we're in it for.
We're going to look at a few of the aspects of the Rugby World Cup in a moment. Interested in the debrief process. What do these weeks after the tournament look like for you?
Bit of rest and recovery first for everybody. So we've had a kind of week of that, but straight into exactly that debrief, because actually, like with so many events, you've got your organising committee current for quite a short period of time. So we've really got from now until to the end of the year to do a debrief, and that includes French government and other stakeholders who are involved. So before everyone mentally moves on to, including ourselves, to whatever's next, that debrief is pretty important. And because we're shifting our model in the future, this was the last Rugby World Cup under a quite traditional kind of outsourced to a host organising committee, where our Rugby World Cup's going forward are much more of a JV. It's almost more important that we capture more of that learning, because we're not doing it in quite the same way in the future.
Is that a big shared Google Doc?
It will be. I'm sure it will be. Yeah, I mean, look, enormous amounts of information to share on every aspect of what is now a really, really big event. So absolutely.
Length of the tournament is something that you mentioned, 7-8 weeks. We're in an era of player safety and player welfare. How do you get to a point where the tournament is maybe a little bit more compact, and is that an aim? Thinking about tournaments to come.
Absolutely an aim, and actually we've just kind of done it. We've looked at a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. The reason this tournament became longer was that we'd already baked in our tournament format. In fact, we'd already baked in our host venues and cities in France, and then made a decision with international rugby players, who are our kind of player body that we deal with at the international level, to guarantee every player, every team, a minimum 5-day rest between matches, which it seems crazy now that we hadn't done that before, but that was a player safety and welfare measure. Because we'd already baked the format in, that meant we had to add a week to the pool phase, effectively, and we've gone from a 6-week, 7-weekend tournament to a 7-week, 8-weekend tournament. And that extra week felt like about a year, I think, to everybody, including the players. And what it meant was that every team also had a prolonged rest period, which not everyone enjoyed from a player perspective and a team perspective in terms of momentum. So we knew already coming into this tournament that we needed for the next Men's World Cup to get back to a more compact tournament. And the answer to that, as counterintuitive as it sounds, is we've taken the opportunity to expand to 24 teams, which means we've got 6 pools of 4, and we've reduced the pool phase by a week while still keeping that minimum rest period in. So we've now got a Women's Rugby World Cup in 2025 with 16 teams, 4 pools of 4, and men's with 24, 6 pools of 4, and they feel a bit more compact. And you'll remember in previous Rugby World Cups, I mean, apart from probably Mondays in the pool phase, we always had matches every day. And even though that's hard work from a tournament delivery perspective, actually from a fan and player experience perspective, again, the momentum that creates, the kind of festival that creates, the media opportunities that creates are pretty significant. So we want to get back to that, where we kind of own the space a bit more.
Let's talk a little bit about the Tier 2 nations. Few mismatches in the pool phase, which is something we've seen at Rugby World Cups past as well. How do you assess the performance of those emerging nations, and what do you see as some of the next steps to bring them into the knockout phase ultimately, and into a more competitive place?
Look, it's a huge challenge for a sport like rugby. I mean, it's challenging in lots of sports, but in a sport like rugby, and particularly I think in the men's landscape at the moment, to close the gap is challenging, and there are a lot of different elements to that. I mean, a number of which we can touch on in terms of investment, in terms of most importantly providing the right type of regular competition for those emerging nations who aren't playing, in what we've got, which is 2 closed competitions. Therein lies part of the challenge. The Six Nations, as wonderful as it is, means that for the other teams in Europe, if you're Georgia, you're Spain, you're Romania, as we've seen, it's hard to close that gap because you're not playing against those teams on a regular basis. Similarly for Japan and Fiji and others that are outside of the existing rugby championship. So addressing that, and we've just done that in this new global calendar discussion, again, across the men's and women's game. We'd already made some steps with a new competition that's just completed in the women's game, WXV. Putting something similar in place in the men's game has been really important. But it isn't just that. It is about investment. It's about building high-performance programs with those nations. We were thrilled to see Portugal and Chile probably more competitive than people expected, and we kind of knew they would be. Everyone was thrilled to see the kind of fairy tale that is Fiji. But again, there's a huge amount of hard work and investment behind Fiji reaching the quarterfinals for the second time in their history, because they're playing as what's called the Fijian Drua in Super Rugby Pacific, the core of that group, week in, week out, in a daily training environment together. Lo and behold, performances on the field reflect that. The same with the Portuguese team, who we fund in a competition called Rugby Europe Super Cup. Core of the team together all the time. So we know that's part of the answer to narrowing that gap. But, more investment and more opportunity is the key part of that.
Perhaps you don't often get a chance to watch rugby at home on the sofa. Maybe you have to be there live. But if you are watching on TV and you've got the sound off for some reason and a penalty is awarded, are you confident that you'll understand why that penalty has been awarded every time?
God, I'd love to say yes, but I mean, the honest answer is no. And I think that's one of our big challenges as a sport. And it was really interesting in the weekend. I'm a Fulham season ticket holder, so watching the round ball game and actually talking to people sitting around me in that environment, we haven't been talking about VAR versus what we call TMO, but the same type of technology, and people saying as football fans and maybe as casual rugby fans who've ended up watching rugby because it's a World Cup, and that's again one of the brilliant things that World Cups do in terms of bringing people in and hopefully holding interest. Exactly that. Watching it, even with the commentary. Do fans understand enough about what is going on? I think we've got a job to do in not just the way the game's played and officiated, but the way the game's presented to help fans better understand what's going on, make it simple for people. And one of the things we've done quite a bit of work on this, and can play around with some things now going into a period after a World Cup, and certainly we use sevens as a bit of an incubator for some of those things. The language we use, the language commentators use, people are talking about caterpillar rucks and jackals, and it's like, well, am I watching a nature program here, or am I watching international sports? So I think only talking to avid fans in the way we present the sport is a challenge, and we need to to take a different tone of voice, I think, in some places.
Although I think David Attenborough presenting the rugby would be
interesting.
Would be good. You mentioned TMO and communication. It struck me watching the tournament that the clarity of communication between the officials, which is obviously broadcast, is fantastic and very explanatory for a kind of not an expert audience, and I guess has been worked on and evolved.
Yeah.
And something that football could probably look at the moment. But how satisfied were you, looking back at the tournament again, with how TMO and technology in general worked?
Look, we've embraced technology certainly more than ever in recent times. I mean, in that space, in terms of officiating now in the player welfare and safety space, and we're using instrumented smart mouth guards throughout the elite levels of the sport. That's really important. So technology's role in rugby is ever expanding. I think we had some really good outcomes of that during the World Cup, and we had some areas again where there's room for improvement. We introduced a kind of off-field foul play review bunker, as it was known, to try and both speed up the game and keep fan interest. And again, whether it's TMO or VAR, we know that those are the moments in a game when, whether you're in the stadium or you're a fan at home, is dead time, and no one wants that in the presentation of an entertainment product. Ultimately, the bunker worked really well in terms of decision making. I think particularly early in the tournament, one of the areas we weren't doing well was communicating how that decision was made, either to the viewer at home or even to the viewer in the stadium. And we improve that over the tournament, but actually that's an area now to sit back and say, and look at, for example, how cricket do it. As a Cricket World Cup obviously taking place right now. They play back in the stadium brilliantly, and they play back actually on the broadcast, those reviews brilliantly. I think we could learn a bit from that.
Foul play bunker is, again, fantastic language. Maybe we should introduce that instead of the naughty step. In terms of
that's quite nice.
For parenting.
For parenting,
the foul play review bunker.
Yeah.
It's
5 minutes in the foul.
Turn that yellow card into a red.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because regardless of sport, through the advent of technology and the application of technology, feels like we're in an era of new rules, increasingly complicated rules, interpretations, new precedents being set. As World Rugby, how are you looking at just the complicated nature of some of these new elements of the game, and sort of how do you see that evolving?
It's a challenge for a sport like rugby. We've got a very complex sport that's, unless you've played it or grown up with someone who's played it, in your household, probably coming to the sport new. I mean, to the earlier point, you look at it and think, what on earth's going on here? So how do we make that much simpler for people, I think? And that's to make it more enjoyable to play and to make it more enjoyable and entertaining to watch. So we now, and we're better at this as a federation in the last few years than previously, getting the right people together. So, if you look at it only through the prism, for example, of kind of high performance specialists and coaches, you don't make the game any simpler. In fact, arguably you make it more complex. So how do we get fan groups involved in feeding back on what we call laws or rules? Certainly the match officials, because if anyone wants a simpler, easier to understand game, it's the match officials who are responsible for the implementation of that. But also, our broadcast partners, media partners, player groups, getting all of those voices together, which isn't easy to do, and that's quite a lengthy process. But I think we're better at that now. And we've done that both in the men's game and separately in the women's game in the last couple of years, because we have to recognise that the women's game is evolving incredibly quickly in terms of professional rugby, but we don't necessarily have to follow all the same challenges we've created in the men's game, whether that's the product on the field or the way it's presented. So we sort of, I guess, put that under the banner of the shape of the game and try and look at, are we presenting a game that's simple to understand and that's enjoyable to play? If not, what can we change and how quickly can we change? Because one of the challenges, again, in a contact sport is any change that seems on the face of it pretty obvious to make, well, what are the unintended consequences of that from a safety, welfare perspective? So there's quite a lot in that in terms of moving the game forward, but I think we're more committed to that than ever because we want to be a global sport that's got fans around the world.
Let's have a little bit of a conversation about the women's game. We've touched on it already a little bit. I think everybody agrees there's a huge opportunity there that you're in the middle of exploring. Where do you see the potential growing pains with the women's game over the next few years?
Look, I think with a lot of sports, the investment that's needed to move quickly and the commercial return are slightly disconnected. So, we are, as a sport, not just World Rugby, but as a sort of ecosystem, everyone's investing hard because you can see whether you're talking participation growth, certainly audience growth that we're already seeing, and long-term commercial growth, the opportunity is huge. We talk about it being the single biggest growth opportunity certainly for rugby, and we believe that. But a lot of the investment hard work is now for future growth. That's challenging, I think, and it's taking everybody again with us. So what we don't want in 10 years' time is women's professional rugby is only established and sustainable in the same places, for example, that men's is. So there's a very different opportunity with the women's game in India than there is for men's rugby, for example. The US women's sevens team potentially meddling in a home games in LA in 28 can be massive for rugby, not just for sevens rugby. So I think it's how you try and focus in on those opportunities without breaking the bank, quite honestly, in the meantime. So doing that in a kind of responsible way, but really dialing up that investment. And that's where, we as a sport, again, more broadly than just World Rugby, I think are looking at investment partners, capital raise opportunities as a real opportunity. Because if we want to have, for example, a women's professional league in the US quickly, well, why do that heavy lifting ourselves? Why not find partners to invest in that type of concept together? So, yeah, opportunity is huge, sensible but fast investment, I think, is the challenge and what we're focused on.
You mentioned sort of outside investment, private equity. We're in an era now in rugby union, certainly, of all sorts of different financial companies coming in and speculating. What's your overall view of how that's playing out? Clearly, you're open to it if you'd like to move forward with something for the women's game. But what are the potential booby traps that you want to be avoiding with this?
We are observing it to some extent within rugby, and closely observing it, obviously, both as a kind of regulator and governing body, but also as an event and media owner. And what does that mean in terms of opportunity? And, obviously Six Nations have taken investment, a number of professional leagues have. And so we're observing it in our own space, and we're observing it certainly more broadly. It's become, as you say, a bit of a phenomenon currently in the sort of sport and entertainment industry. So I think it's about understanding what's working and not working. We've certainly seen, even in, I think, potentially some of the global calendar work we've just done across the men's and women's games, that better alignment of stakeholder outcomes, better alignment of stakeholders driving towards collaboration. Investment's definitely helping in that space. Is it moving it forward as quickly as it might do in other industries? Probably not, because of the nature of sport and certainly the nature of sort of federated membership models that we have in sports like rugby. But the opportunity, and we talked about it earlier a little bit, how do you make your sport more entertaining, more understood, more global? Most of those things require investment and speed. And I think what we're seeing is, private capital and private investment is helping in those spaces. I think in terms of booby traps, doing that responsibly, again, doing that in an environment where you're taking a lot of different stakeholders with you. Crucial group in that for us as a sport is bringing the players with us and making sure that, what we can't have in a sport like rugby is private money just drives, for example, wage inflation to a point where, the club game, for example, is, completely unsustainable, or we've only got a couple of places in the world where it is sustainable. So I think there are watch outs in that space, and there are clearly watch outs in the longer term around, and I hate to use the word control, but making sure the sport is controlling the game rather than it being controlled necessarily by others. And that juxtaposition probably of what happens on the field with everything investing around creating a better product and entertainment, I think is quite interesting.
Let's talk a little bit about you.
It's Alan
Therapy.
It's Alan time.
Yeah.
COO of World Rugby for a good long period, had a stint as interim CEO and then became CEO officially in 2021.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about the adjustment when you go from COO, C-suite, important, critical role, to the boss.
Yeah, I mean, again, fascinating in one sense because it was during COVID. So, come out of Rugby World Cup in 2019. I was, as you say, already COO, quite focused on running World Cups and running our sort of commercial business. Brett Gosper, my predecessor and my boss at the time, then stepped down at the end of 2020. So that all happened, that whole thought process and Brett moving happened during COVID, and then obviously an interim period, and then eventually appointed as CEO in March 21. So in one sense, the adjustment was a little bit kind of artificial because we weren't together with colleagues. I wasn't providing maybe leadership in the sort of traditional sense. I had the benefit of having been at sort of 6-7 years within World Rugby. I think that the adjustment would have been really hard for somebody coming from outside of the organisation in at that point. And as we've come through that and through the last couple of years, I think the adjustment's been significant because I went from running really the business side of World Rugby to now taking responsibility for the whole. I've spent a lot more time on issues like player safety and welfare, the way the game is shaped, how it's played, the sort of pure rugby side than I ever did in the past. So that's been fascinating, challenging and invigorating probably all at the same time. Look, great team, great colleagues. We've grown a lot in that time. We've gone from probably 150 people pre-COVID in World Rugby to around 300. So it's a big period of growth and transformation as well. So that's been, again, a lot of fun but hard work.
Would you care to give yourself a grade so far?
No, you must give yourself a grade.
I think I'm probably a 7 out of 10 right now.
You went for the numerical system, which was interesting, rather than a letter.
Okay. And rather than a letter.
You're going to have to change that as you go into to America.
I'm going to be a B then, maybe a B minus. there's a lot to do. There's a lot of opportunity. I think rugby's got a great opportunity to really grow as a sport, to really take hold of some of the advantages and opportunities that we've got, values-based, get a sport that gets the pulse racing for a lot of people in a lot of places, but also we're a big sport in a small number of countries, many of which are relatively small economies. That's a lot of ambition to change. The US, the women's game are massive drivers of those opportunities. So I probably grade myself lower than I should, because I think we've got a lot of space still to head into.
You look around the rugby world and, there are large physical people everywhere, and maybe there are some people who come across as a bit intimidating. And I just wonder, in your job, having to press a lot of flesh and talk to a lot of people, is there anyone that intimidates you, or you have to G yourself up for before you talk to them?
I wouldn't, no particular individuals. I mean, I think we've got some people in the sport who have been around a long time, huge knowledge, incredibly passionate. So we're lucky as a sport. We've got a lot of former players in the sport as a whole. So I don't think there's anyone who stands out as particularly intimidating. But again, I think one of the things, and it's certainly a post-COVID thing more than ever, spending more time with our membership, with our key stakeholders has been a really important focus for me in the last couple of years. So getting out and I guess that breaks down some of that intimidation or potentially intimidating factor, is just spending time with people. And again, ultimately realising what is binding us all together is a desire to move the sport forward, to really celebrate what we have in the sport, and ultimately to grow it.
One of the perceptions around rugby is sometimes that it feels a bit committee heavy. And working within a federation, I imagine you experience a lot of that. And you talked about doing a lot of work around governance, which is very often the less visible but important, critical stuff that you as a CEO need to do. Give us the pros and cons of committees and the reality of working in that environment.
I think it can be hugely frustrating at times, and we see that. I certainly feel that at times, having had a very sort of commercial background before I was in World Rugby, even though I knew the organisation really well from my time at IMG and the work that we did with them. So frustrating, I think, and when it's frustrating, it's largely because you're not moving quickly enough. I think one of the things we've done well with our own governance reviews and progress in the last couple of years, and again, I know that a number of federations and governing bodies have, and again, partly maybe influenced by either external capital and external investment coming in, or the desire to be ready for that. And there's some of that probably in our own approach. Committees, when they're functioning well, I think, are making decisions based on great information. A lot of our responsibility as a kind of C-suite, as an organisation, is to make sure we're providing the right information in the right way to move forward through those structures quite quickly. Again, we have a sport that's inherently, quite physical in its nature. Law change, player safety issues, all of those things need the right people discussing them, bringing together player groups, officials groups, some of our membership, but also those processes need to be, as efficient as possible. So I think we're getting better at it, but it can feel, I think, certainly to the outside world, like, wow, you're really kind of trudging through committee after committee. From a governance perspective, reduce the duplication, put better processes in place, create the right information flow. Hopefully people are making decisions in the right way.
Have you got a favourite committee?
Oof.
Are you allowed to say?
We've got a lot of committees. A lot of the work we do in the player welfare space, I think, in the last 2 years has been incredibly important for us as a sport, not just in response to litigation and issues around head impact, but just, again, leading into technology. And so I think our committees around what we would call men's and women's high performance, that consider those issues, are really important in what we do, and a lot of the unseen part probably of the sport, and that's fine.
What's your favourite committee?
I don't really have one. But I'm going to think about it and reflect on it for next time.
We had a period, I think, where we had a committee on committees. So a committee talking about trying to make other committees better and reducing them in size.
Sounds like meetings about meetings.
Yeah. We don't have a tie committee, I'm pleased to say.
Before you joined World Rugby, or IRB as it was then, I think,
just about,
you ran the hospitality business at London 2012 and in the lead up to the London Olympics. With that in mind, what would you say now in 2023 is the perfect sports hospitality experience?
Wow.
And why is it rugby?
Look, I think rugby provides a great landscape for what we now call premium experiences and hospitality. It's again values based. I think that the atmosphere people love. There's no kind of animosity. You've got no segregation in a crowd. The atmosphere that builds. We've just seen obviously that writ large in some brilliant games in a Rugby World Cup. So there's a great, that's one part of what you need for a great premium experience is what is happening in the stadium, what's the atmosphere like. I think in terms of what experience is being delivered, that's the bit that I think since I was doing hospitality with London 2012 has shifted the most, because people are connecting in all different ways, and it's no longer really about sitting down at a table of 10 or a table of 12 and having a seated meal and then going off and watching your sport and maybe doing a bit of the same afterwards. It's much more about an immersive experience of connecting with, if you're the host, connecting with your clients and your guests, or if you're the guest, having that experience around you. So I think we're seeing a lot of that. That creates its own challenges in terms of the way that facilities and stadiums and infrastructure is built. And I think we're seeing therefore a shift in that as well. I mean, you look at, to pick one example, I think that the facilities, for example, at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, absolutely outstanding. And that's how to build the landscape for world-class hospitality and premium experiences, and fair play to them for the investment they've made in that. The trouble is, as everyone can see, is that's out of date quite quickly, and people move on to the next experience. And you've only got to look at the venues that are being built in the US around those spaces to see where that's headed. So, yeah, I think rugby, again, has got a great opportunity to be a real leader in that space, but it's not one size fits all, one experience. What works at the Hong Kong Sevens is very different to what we're going to see at a World Cup or a Six Nations match.
Let's hone in a little bit on the emotion of rugby, because I think more than any other sport, perhaps, the combination of atmosphere, the anthems, the camaraderie amongst the different sets of fans, particularly at national level, it seems genuinely unique.
The lack of spite as well.
The lack of spite.
In the crowd.
Yes. What is it about rugby that taps into that sort of emotional connection so well?
Look, it's a great question, one we think about a lot, as you can imagine, because it's something we absolutely want to hold on to. And again, we've just seen it in a Women's World Cup last year in New Zealand. We've just seen it on a very large scale in a Men's World Cup. I think you can go all the way back to the kind of values of the game on the field. I mean, it is fascinating to watch a group of young kids playing rugby, and then maybe the same group of young kids playing football, and how their behaviours are slightly different in the way they talk to the referee, in the way that they interact with each other. So there is something incredibly values-based about that, and we've got to be careful that that's not, we don't make that kind of holier than thou, because that shouldn't, they've got to be genuine values, not something that's kind of marketing sort of puff on our part, for sure. But there is something to hold on to there in the way that rugby's taught and the skills that it teaches. And then you take that through into the crowd, and as you say, you've just got this incredible atmosphere where you've got no segregation of fans, a very physical, emotional sport taking place on the field. The fans often, certainly in World Cups, very, very engaged with that, and yet no aggression or animosity in the venue, and a very celebratory atmosphere. I mean, for example, I thought the French fans were brilliant. I mean, regardless of whether France were playing or not, even before France exited in the quarterfinals, you'd be in a stadium. I was in a stadium in Lille watching Tonga and Romania. I would imagine of the 48,000 people that are there, probably 70% of them are French on a Sunday evening, just creating a brilliant spectacle of entertainment in the crowd, singing their anthem, still singing the French anthem, great anthem that it is. So there's something in that we just have to keep moving forward with. And I think as long as we can provide that ever increasing spectator experience, but hold that together, there's something really special there that maybe other sports don't quite have. And that emotion will continue then, I think.
When do you get emotional on the job?
Well, actually, quite often. And I think, we've got an amazing, committed team of people in World Rugby at every level. So we're nearly 300 people in World Rugby. I think the passion that people bring to the job that cuts through any kind of corporate hardness that you have from having been around for a long time. So certainly emotional about what we're doing and our connection to purpose. I think that's really important to me individually, but in the way that certainly I approach sort of leadership. and ultimately emotional about the game. And I had a tear or two in the eye at the end of a World Cup. I'm not ashamed to say, men's and women's again. I mean, just amazing atmosphere, amazing occasions, and to for your job to be part of something that's so special to so many people is quite an emotional attachment, I think.
So you're a crier, are you, Alan?
I can be.
Just not on camera.
Just not.
Tell us about the hardest decision that you've had to make.
One of the hardest decisions I had to make, actually, going back a number of years now, was to leave IMG. I had an amazing kind of experience with IMG. I joined IMG as a lawyer, loved it. Loved working in a very commercial environment, but obviously in sport, and literally couldn't sort of lap it up enough in terms of the learning experience of that, and understanding deal making and sort of commercial side of sport. And I had this great opportunity. I was about to move with my very young family at the time to New Zealand to be involved for the last couple of years of planning for Rugby World Cup. So we were going to move there full time. I'd paid the first 3 months, still rankles now, paid the first 3 months deposit on the house, found a kindergarten place for then 4-year-old, I think, daughter. And so to not do all of that, but I had this amazing opportunity to work on a London Olympic Games, and a number of people said to me, a home Olympics, and it was a step up in terms of leadership role for me. So, but that was a really tough decision, one of those ones you have to sort of really make with the family, and but I don't look back with any regret on that, but really tough decision at the time.
Be nice to get that deposit back there, right?
It would be good to get that deposit back. I can't believe he kept it.
We're about to wrap up. What's the next big decision you have to make once we switch the cameras off here?
I think we've got a lot of big decisions to make in rugby in the next couple of years, and again, really ambitious strategic plan. We've just gone through a period of a massive men's World Cup, a really successful women's World Cup. We're coming into a period, next women's World Cup in England in 25. I think we've got a lot of decisions to make about now what we do with that ambition. So how aggressive are we going to be about pursuing growth? How aggressive are we going to be about being brave about the way the game's presented, as we were talking earlier on? So I think there's a lot of big decisions coming for the sport. I'm one part of those decisions, but I feel, I guess, the responsibility of trying to drive forward towards those things. But again, that's what's great about the job.
Alan Gilpin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.